Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The Present Situation and the Next Tasks by the National Convention of the CPUSA, 1945. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this reading is the next installment in the First Wave U.S. Anti-Revisionism playlist, also known as the Anti-Browderism playlist. You can find this playlist on YouTube either by searching for it or by going to the Home tab and then scrolling down to the Narrative playlist section. This reading is also included in the collection Marxism-Leninism versus Revisionism, which also has its own playlist, and constitutes Phase 2 of the Anti-Browderism playlist, which we're almost done with now. Basically, these are the official responses to Browderism after leaders of the CPUSA reconstituted the party following General Secretary Earl Browder's dissolution of it. In the third leg of this playlist, we're going to get into some criticisms of how these responses perhaps weren't far-reaching enough, and there are some really interesting readings in there. Currently, that section of the playlist is planned for summer 2025. So as to this reading, it's the resolution of the National Convention of the Communist Party USA, adopted July 28, 1945. Let's begin. Part 1, Section 1. The military defeat of Nazi Germany is a great historic victory for world democracy, for all mankind. This epical triumph was brought about by the concerted action of the Anglo-Soviet American coalition, by the decisive blows of the Red Army, by the American-British offensives, and by the historic struggle of the resistance movements. This victory opens the way for the complete destruction of fascism in Europe and weakens the forces of reaction and fascism everywhere. It has already brought forth a new anti-fascist unity of the peoples in Europe, marked by the formation in a number of countries of democratic governments representative of the will of the people and of the Labour progressive election victory in Great Britain. The crushing of Hitler Germany has also created the conditions for the complete defeat and destruction of fascist Japanese imperialism. The winning of complete victory in this just war of national liberation is the first prerequisite for obtaining peace and security in the Far East, for the democratic unification of China as a free and independent nation, and for the attainment of national independence by the peoples of Indonesia, Indochina, Burma, Korea, Formosa, the Philippines, and India. The smashing of fascist militarist Japan is likewise essential to help guarantee the efforts of the United Nations to build a durable peace. All these crucial objectives are of vital importance to the national interests of the American people, to the struggle for the complete destruction of fascism everywhere. Now, with the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Axis, the possibility of realizing an enduring peace and of making new democratic advances and social progress has been opened up for the peoples by the weakening of reaction and fascism on a world scale and the consequent strengthening of the worldwide democratic forces. Section 2. However, a sharp and sustained struggle must still be conducted to realize these possibilities. This is so because the economic and social roots of fascism in Europe have not yet been fully destroyed. This is so because the extremely powerful reactionary forces in the United States and England, which are centered in the trusts and cartels, are striving to reconstruct liberated Europe on a reactionary basis. Moreover, this is so because the most aggressive circles of American imperialism are endeavoring to secure for themselves political and economic domination in the world. The dominant sections of American finance capital supported the war against Nazi Germany, not because of hatred for fascism or a desire to liberate suffering Europe from the heel of Nazi despotism, but because it recognized in Hitler Germany a dangerous imperialist rival determined to rule the world. From the very inception of the struggle against fascism, American finance capital feared the democratic consequences of defeating Hitler Germany. This explains why the monopolists opposed the concept of collective security in the days when the war still could have been prevented, and instead chose the Munich policy, which inevitably led to war. Later, even after the anti-Hitler coalition was forged, the forces of big capital who supported the war continued to hesitate and delay, to make vital concessions to the worst enemies of American and world democracy, to the sworn foes of the Soviet Union and to the bosom pals of Hitlerism. That is why American capitalism gave aid to Franco Spain, why it preferred to support the Pétains and Darlans and the reactionary governments in exile as against the heroic resistance movements of the people. And that is also why it hoped that the Soviet Union would be bled on the battlefields of Europe, and why it tried to hold off the opening of the Second Front until the last possible moment. Only when these policies proved to be bankrupt, meeting growing opposition from the ranks of the people, from the millions of patriotic Americans fighting in our heroic armed forces and working in war production, only when it became obvious that the Soviet Union was emerging from the war stronger and more influential than ever, precisely because of its valiant and triumphant all-out war against Nazism, did American capital reluctantly and belatedly move toward the establishment of a concerted military strategy and closer unity among the Big Three. Now that the war against Hitler Germany has been won, the American economic royalists, like their British Tory counterparts, are alarmed at the strengthened positions of world labor, at the democratic advances in Europe, and at the upsurge of the national liberation movements in the colonial and dependent countries. Therefore, they seek to halt the march of democracy, to curb the strength of labor and the people. They want to save the remnants of fascism in Germany and the rest of Europe. They're trying to organize a new cordon sanitaire against the Soviet Union, which bore the main brunt of the war against the Nazis, and which is the staunchest champion of national freedom, democracy, and world peace. This growing reactionary opposition to a truly democratic and anti-fascist Europe, in which the people will have the right to choose freely their own forms of government and social system, has been reflected in many of the recent actions of the State Department. This explains why, at San Francisco, Stettinius and Connolly joined hands with Vandenberg, the spokesman for Hoover and the most predatory sections of American finance capital. This explains the ceding of fascist Argentina, as well as the aid given to the pro-fascist forces of Latin America, the British-American reluctance to live up to the Yalta Accord on Poland, the American delegation's refusal to join with the Soviet Union in pledging the right of national independence for mandated territories and colonies, and to give official recognition to the representatives of the World Labor Congress. These facts reflect the current shift of hitherto win-the-war sections of American capital to closer political collaboration with the most reactionary and aggressively imperialist groupings of monopoly capital. It is this reactionary position of American big business which explains why powerful circles in Washington, and also London, are pursuing the dangerous policy of trying to prevent a strong, united, and democratic China, why they bolster up the reactionary, incompetent Chiang Kai-shek regime, and why they harbor the idea of a compromise peace with the Mikado in the hope of maintaining Japan as a reactionary bulwark in the Far East. It accounts, too, for the renewed campaign of anti-Soviet slander and incitement calculated to undermine American-Soviet friendship and cooperation. On the home front, the big trusts and monopolies are blocking the development of a satisfactory program to meet the human needs of reconversion, of the problems of economic dislocations and severe unemployment, which is beginning to take place and will become more acute after the defeat of Japan. Reactionary forces, especially the National Association of Manufacturers and their representatives in government and Congress, are beginning a new open-shop drive to smash the trade unions. Comment, the Taft-Hartley Act was not yet introduced at this point. Continuing, they also endeavor to rob the Negro people of their wartime gains. They are trying to prevent the adoption of governmental measures, which must be enacted at once if our country is to avoid the most acute consequences of the trying reconversion period and the cyclical economic crisis which is bound to arise after the war. Likewise, they are vigorously preparing to win a reactionary victory in the crucial 1946 elections. Already the reactionaries are using the increased cutbacks to lower wages and living standards and to provoke strikes in war industry. They are obstructing the enactment of necessary emergency measures for federal and state unemployment insurance. They are sponsoring vicious anti-labor legislation, such as the new Ball-Burton-Hatch Labor Relations Bill, and are blocking the passage of the FEPC and anti-poll tax bills. They are trying to scuttle effective price and rent control and to exempt the wealthy and the big corporations from essential tax legislation. They are endeavoring to place the entire cost of the war and the difficulties of reconversion upon the shoulders of the working people. If the reactionary policies and forces of monopoly capital are not checked and defeated, America and the world will be confronted with new aggressions and wars and the growth of reaction and fascism in the United States. Section 3. However, the conditions and forces exist to defeat this reactionary threat and to enable our country to play a more progressive role in world affairs in accord with the true national interests of the American people. For one thing, the military defeat of Nazi Germany has changed the relationship of world forces in favor of democracy. It has enhanced the role and influence of the land of socialism. It is bringing into being a new democratic Europe. It has strengthened those forces in our country and elsewhere which seek to maintain and consolidate the friendship and cooperation of the United States and the Soviet Union, a unity which must now be extended and reinforced if a durable peace is to be secured. This is evidenced by the fact that the overwhelming majority of the American people, and in the first place the labor movement, which has grown in strength and maturity, is opposed to reaction and fascism, and supports the foreign and domestic policies of the late President Roosevelt as embodied in the decisions of Crimea and in the main features of the Second Bill of Rights. This is demonstrated by the great mass support for the San Francisco Charter and by the determination of the American people to guarantee that the United Nations Security Organization shall fulfill its historic objectives, that the amity and unity of action of the American-Soviet-British coalition shall be consolidated in support of the agreements of Tehran, Crimea, and Potsdam, shall be strengthened in the post-war period and made more solid and effective in order to prevent or check the recurrence of new aggressions and wars. This majority of the American people must now speak out and assert its collective strength and will. The united power of labor and of all democratic forces, welded in a firm anti-fascist national unity, must express itself in a decisive fashion so as to influence the course of the nation in a progressive direction. So commenting here, I liked Williamson's speech better, the previous entry in this list. I'm really finding Foster to be like Browder light. As we discussed in the earlier entries, a lot of Foster's criticisms of Browder centered on Browder's embrace of monopoly capital as, quote, progressive. And that was correctly called out as just straight up liberalism. But, I mean, it's completely egregious and has absolutely no place in any kind of communist discourse, let alone from the General Secretary of the CPUSA. But when Foster steps in to fill those shoes, I'm finding that he's repeating a lot of the same kinds of things, just with the most egregious things taken out. It's my impression of Foster so far. Continuing. It is imperative that the American people insist that the Truman administration carry forward the policies of the Roosevelt Labor Democratic Coalition for American-Soviet Friendship, for the vital social aims of the Economic Bill of Rights, for civil liberties, for the rights of the Negro people, and for collective bargaining. It is equally necessary that labor and the people sharply criticize all hesitations to apply those policies and vigorously oppose any concession to the reactionaries by the Truman administration, which is tending to make certain concessions under the increasing pressure of the reactionary imperialist combination led by the monopolies. And just to expand on that previous comment, I mean, most of that is roughly correct as far as protecting and expanding the existing civil liberties under bourgeois society. But I just find Foster to cling to more of a conservative path in his rhetoric. It kind of just hugs the guardrail in terms of saying the bare minimum of correct things while not really being very inspiring. Whereas if you contrast this with like Eugene Debs, for example, you listen to a Debs speech, you immediately, halfway through the speech, want to run out and do something. You know, that to me is communist leadership, which can really effectively agitate and educate, effortlessly without even appearing to try, just sort of radiating a sort of, call to action continuously, a sort of sharpener of class consciousness that works just by standing in close proximity to it. Foster, on the other hand, I dare say is just kind of boring to listen to. It's this very stay the course, there are large forces in motion kind of rhetoric, and I'm just not getting anything out of that. It, again, sounds to me like he took Browderism and just sort of cut out the most egregious parts and kept the same basic framework. Continuing to talk about the Roosevelt Labor Democratic Coalition, etc. I think that these are really just instilling false hopes in people. Anyway, let's continue. The Truman administration, like the Roosevelt government from which it is developing, continues to receive the support of the Roosevelt Labor Democratic Coalition and responds to various class pressures, while it seeks to maintain contact and cooperative relations with labor and the more democratic forces of the coalition. Its general orientation in both domestic and foreign policies tends on some vital questions to move away from the more consistent democratic forces in the coalition and tries to conciliate certain reactionaries. Hence, it is of central importance to build systematically the political strength and influence of labor, the Negro people, and all true democratic forces within the general coalition for the struggle against imperialist reaction, for combating and checking all tendencies and groupings in the coalition willing to make concessions to reaction. The camp of reaction must not be appeased. It must be isolated and routed. Toward this end, it is necessary, as never before, to strengthen decisively the democratic unity of the nation, to create that kind of national unity for the post-war period which will be able to facilitate the destruction of fascism abroad and to prevent fascism from coming to power in the United States. Therefore, it is essential to weld together and consolidate the broadest coalition of all anti-fascist and democratic forces, as well as all other supporters of Roosevelt's anti-Axis policies. To forge this democratic coalition most effectively and to enable it to exercise decisive influence upon the affairs of the nation, it is essential that the working class, especially the progressive labor movement and the communists, strengthen its independent role and activities and display far greater political and organizing initiative. It is imperative that maximum unity of action be developed among the CIO, the AFL, and the Railroad Brotherhoods, and that their full participation in the New World Federation of Trade Unions be achieved. It is necessary to rally and imbue the membership and lower officials of the AFL with confidence in their ability to fight against and defeat the reactionary policies and leadership typified by the Greens, Walls, Hutchisons, and Dubinskys. While cooperating with the patriotic and democratic forces from all walks of life, labor must in the first place strengthen its ties with the veterans, the working farmers, the Negro people, youth, women, intellectuals, and small businessmen, and with their democratic organizations. At the same time, while forging the progressive unity of the nation, labor should cooperate with those capitalist groupings and elements who, for one or another reason, objectively at times promote democratic aims. But in so doing, labor must depend first of all upon its own strength and unity, and upon its alliance with the true democratic and anti-fascist forces of the nation. So, commenting again, this is the same kind of class collaborationist stuff which really was the hallmark of Browderism during World War II, the Popular Front strategy taken to an extreme. Of course, Browder took it even beyond the extreme into monopoly capital is now progressive. But for perspective on how even this is not really going to serve the communist movement, recall what happened just a few years after this speech was given, 1945. The Second Red Scare, McCarthyism. It's a vast underestimation of the power of reaction and an overestimation of this, democratic class collaborationist coalition. It's really kind of a maddening complacency in my view. Anyway, continuing, the current war and post-war needs of the working class and the nation, including the adoption of an effective reconversion program and the maintenance of workers' living standards, also demand the initiation of large-scale mass campaigns to organize the millions of still unorganized workers. This is imperative if organized labor is to achieve its full strength and fulfill its role as the leading democratic force of the nation. In the vital struggle to crush feudal fascist militaristic Japan, it is necessary that American labor reaffirm its no-strike pledge. And commenting, I'm going to finish the reading, but mentally at this point, I'm more or less checking out. This guy really just seems like the new Browder to me. Anyway, continuing, and give the necessary leadership to mobilize the people for carrying the war through to final victory and for national liberation aims. In so doing, labor must collaborate in the prosecution of the anti-Japanese war with all democratic forces who favor and support complete victory over Japanese imperialism. However, labor and the other anti-fascist forces must take cognizance of the fact that amongst those big business circles who desire military victory over Japan, which they would get, in fact, just a week and a half after this convention, when the U.S. military would drop 2 atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in early August. So, this just pretending that labor is really part of the ruling coalition here, I think was self-delusion. I'm familiar with the reasoning behind the arguments laid out here by Foster from a communist perspective. I just don't think in reality that it's squared with the actual situation on the ground in U.S. politics, and thus it's just misleading. Anyway, continuing, including some in the State Department who are seeking a compromise peace which will preserve the power of the Mikado after the war at the expense of China and the other Far Eastern peoples and directed against the Soviet Union. Similarly, there are powerful capitalist groupings, including many in administration circles, who plan to use the coming defeat of Japan for imperialist aims, for maintaining a reactionary puppet Kuomintang regime in China, for obtaining American imperialist domination in the Far East. Labor and the people should and will continue to do all in their power to hasten complete victory over Japanese militarism and fascism. To do this, labor and the popular forces must fight for and rally the people for a consistent anti-fascist and an anti-imperialist policy, and must rely, first of all, upon the people and their democratic organizations and aspirations. Section 4. To achieve the widest democratic coalition and the most effective anti-fascist unity of the nation, it is vital that labor vigorously champion a program of action that will promote the complete destruction of fascism, speed victory over Japanese imperialism, curb the powers of the trusts and monopolies, and thereby advance the economic welfare of the people, and protect and extend American democracy. And just a comment again, this just keeps bugging me, how much it sounds like reformism. Like, there is acknowledgement that there are reactionary forces that are going to push back on this, but basically there seems to be a faith and a trust that this kind of progress will be maintained even after capitalism has entered the stage of decay under imperialism. World War II wasn't the end of fascism. It was just the beginning. It was the first chapter. And instead of bracing for that and, holding a discussion about if there is a big anti-communist crackdown, what are they going to do, etc., it's still this kind of popular front, the objectively democratic at times national bourgeoisie, etc. Foster is about to lay out the program. And again, it's just a snooze fest that I think was really out of sync with the reality. So, if one of the criticisms under Browder is that communists had more or less renounced their position within the socio-political landscape, I'm not really sure that this changed much in that respect. So, continuing, in the opinion of the Communist Party, such a program should be based on the following slogans of action. 1. Speed the defeat of fascist militarist Japan. Prosecute the war against Japan resolutely to unconditional surrender. Rout and defeat the advocates of a compromise peace with the Japanese imperialists and warlords. Curb those who seek American imperialist control in the Far East. Strengthen United Nations cooperation to guarantee post-war peace in the Pacific and the world, and to ensure a free democratic Asia with the right of national independence for all colonial and dependent peoples. Press for a united and free China based upon the unity of the communists and all other democratic and anti-Japanese forces so as to speed victory. Give full military aid to the Chinese guerrillas led by the heroic 8th and 4th Armies. Continue uninterrupted war production and uphold labor's no-strike pledge for the duration. Stop employer provocations. 2. Complete the destruction of fascism and build a durable peace. Cement American-Soviet friendship and unity to promote an enduring peace and to carry through the destruction of fascism. Carry out in full the decisions made by the Big Three at Tehran, Crimea, and Potsdam. Punish the war guilty without further delay, including the German and Japanese staffs and monopolists. Death to all fascist war criminals. Make Germany and Japan pay full reparations. Strengthen the World Labor Congress as the backbone of the unity of the peoples and the free nations. Admit the World Labor Congress to the Economic and Social Council of the World Security Organization. Support the San Francisco Charter for an effective international security organization based upon the unity of the Big Three. So commenting again, I have to say this really sounds eerily reminiscent of Browder and the expectations that this peace between the US, USSR, and UK would go on indefinitely into the future, when we know that basically as soon as the war was over, the Cold War started. So it just sounds like more continuity than change to me in terms of these policies. And also, this is like a nice wish list, I guess. But I mean, how much of this was actually within the reach of the Communist Party to implement? So it seems to me like their power fell way short of being able to do most of this. So it kind of came down to cheerleading bourgeois established power structures and, then trying to claim that you had influenced them in that direction, or even deluding yourself into thinking that you'd done it yourself. To me, it doesn't sound like an independent class perspective, and I don't know, I have real trouble following this. But anyway, continuing. Guarantee to all peoples the right to determine freely their own destiny and to establish their own democratic form of government. Put an end to Anglo-American political and military intervention against the peoples, such as in Greece, Belgium, and Italy. Admit Italy to the ranks of the United Nations. Grant the right of self-determination to Puerto Rico and the Philippines. Support the Puerto Rican and Filipino peoples in their demands for immediate and complete independence. Break diplomatic relations with fascist Spain and Argentina. Full support to the democratic forces fighting to reestablish the Spanish Republic. Support the struggles of the Latin American peoples for national sovereignty and against the encroachments of American and British imperialism. Remove from the State Department all pro-fascist and reactionary officials. Help feed and reconstruct starving and war-torn Europe. Reject the Hoover program based on reactionary financial mortgages and political interference. Use the Bretton Woods Agreement in the interests of the United Nations to promote international economic cooperation and expanding world trade. Grant extensive long-term loans and credits at low interest rates for purposes of reconstruction and industrialization. Expose and combat all efforts of monopoly capital to convert such financial aid into means of extending imperialist control in these countries. 3. Push the fight for 60 million jobs. Meet the human needs of reconversion. Make the right to work and the democratic aims of the Second Bill of Rights the law of the land. Support the Murray Full Employment Bill. Increase purchasing power to promote maximum employment. No reduction in weekly take-home pay when overtime is eliminated. Revise the Little Steel formula to increase wages so as to meet the rise in the cost of living. Pass the Pepper 65-cent minimum hourly wage bill. Support the Seamen's Bill of Rights, H.R. 2346. Defend the wartime gains of the Negro workers in industry. Establish the guaranteed annual wage in industry. Establish a shorter work week except where this would hamper war production. Enforce the right to work and to equality in job status for women. Guarantee the exercise of this right by adequate training, upgrading, seniority rights, as well as by providing day nurseries and child care centers to aid all working mothers. Safeguard and extend existing social legislation for women as workers and mothers, and abolish all discriminatory legislation against women. Support President Truman's proposals for emergency federal legislation to extend and supplement present unemployment insurance benefits as a necessary first step to cope with the current large-scale cutbacks and layoffs. Start unemployment insurance payments promptly upon loss of job and continue until new employment is found. Provide adequate severance pay for laid-off workers. Prevent growing unemployment during the reconversion and post-war period by starting large-scale federal, state, municipal, and local public works programs, rural and urban, slum clearance, low rental housing developments, rural electrification, waterway projects such as the St. Lawrence and the Missouri Valley, the building of new schools, hospitals, roads, etc. No scrapping of government-owned industrial plants. Guarantee the operation of these plants at full capacity for peacetime purposes. Establish public ownership of the munitions, power, and utility industries to place them under democratic control. Support all measures for full farm production. Defeat the advocates of scarcity. Extend and strengthen the Farm Price Support Program. Establish low-cost credit and adequate crop insurance. Safeguard the family-sized farms. Help tenant farmers to become owners. End the semi-feudal sharecropping system in the South. So, this is going to continue to go on for quite a while. I so far haven't seen any commentary about how much of this they thought was actually going to be possible under decaying capitalism. I think that might be a valid discussion to have at this point, but anyway, let's go on. Maintain and rigidly enforce rent and price control and rationing. Strengthen the law enforcement powers of the OPA. Smash the black market. Prosecute the war profiteers. No reduction or refunds in corporate, excess profit, and income taxes for the millionaires and big corporations. Lower taxes for those least able to pay. Pass the Wagner-Murray-Dingle Social Security Bill. 4. Keep faith with the men who fight for victory. Raise substantially dependence allotments to families and relatives of men in the armed forces. Extend and improve the system of democratic orientation and discussion in the armed forces. Draw more personnel from labor's ranks into orientation work. Eliminate all anti-labor and anti-democratic material and teachings from the education services conducted in the armed forces. Guarantee jobs, opportunity, and security for all returning veterans and war workers, regardless of race, creed, or color. Extend the scope and benefit of the GI Bill of Rights and eliminate all red tape from the Veterans Administration. Guarantee adequate medical care to every veteran. Press for the speedy enactment of legislation providing for substantial demobilization pay based on length and character of service and financed by taxes on higher personal and corporate incomes. Include full benefits of all veterans legislation to Negro veterans. 5. Safeguard and extend democracy. Enforce equal rights for every American citizen regardless of race, color, creed, sex, political affiliation, or national origin. End Jim Crow. Establish a permanent FEPC on state and national scales. Abolish the poll tax and the white primary. End every form of discrimination in the armed forces. Protect the rights of the foreign-born. Outlaw anti-Semitism, one of the most pernicious and damaging of fascism's ideological weapons. Support the just demands of the Jewish people for the immediate abrogation by the British government of the imperialist white paper. Support the upbuilding of a Jewish national home in a free and democratic Palestine, in collaboration with the Arab people on the basis of the agreement of the Big Three in the Near East. Protect and extend labor's rights, especially the right to organize, strike, and bargain collectively. Repeal all anti-labor laws such as the Smith-Connolly Act. Defeat the Ball-Burton-Hatch anti-labor bill. Outlaw and prohibit all fascist organizations and activities and every form of racial and religious bigotry. Rescind all anti-communist legislation. Curb the powers and policies of the monopolies and trusts which jeopardize the national welfare and world peace. Prosecute and punish all violations of the antitrust laws. Demand government dissolution of all monopolies and trusts found guilty of attempting to restore the Anglo-German-American cartel system. Revoke their patent rights and prosecute their officials. Enact new legislation subjecting the monopolies to a greater measure of public control with labor, farm, and small business representation on all government bodies exercising such supervision. Protect and extend federal aid to small business. 6. Safeguard the future of America's youth. Guarantee full and equal opportunity for education and jobs for all youth. Establish an adequate program of training and retraining in new and higher skills during the period of reconversion. Fix adequate minimum wage standards and guarantee equal pay for equal work to young men and women workers. Reestablish and strengthen minimum working standards for working minors, which have been relaxed during the war. Abolish child labor. Pass legislation for adequate federal aid to schools and students, especially in the South. Establish full and equal opportunity for schooling, including college education. Guarantee full academic freedom. Enact federal legislation to safeguard the health and well-being of the youth. Develop adequate recreational, cultural, and social programs for democratic citizenship in schools and communities as a means to prevent juvenile delinquency. Establish the right to vote at 18 by state legislation. Establish a federal government agency, including representation of youth and labor, to develop and coordinate planning to meet the nation's responsibility to youth. Adopt special safeguards for guaranteeing education, vocational training, and job opportunities for Negro youth. This program meets the most urgent immediate interests of the American people and nation. It is a program of action around which all progressive Americans can unite today. It is a program of action which will advance the struggle for the moral and political defeat of fascism, leading to its final destruction and eradication. It will help create the conditions and guarantees for a stable peace and for a larger measure of economic security and democratic liberties for the masses of the people. The anti-fascist and democratic forces of our nation, being the overwhelming majority of our people, can become strong enough to check and defeat imperialist reaction and to realize the great objectives of this program of action. As class-conscious American workers, as Marxists, we communists will do all in our power to help the American working class and its allies to fight for and realize this program. At the same time, we will systematically explain to the people that substantial gains for the masses secured under capitalism are inevitably precarious, unstable, and only partial, and that socialism alone can finally and completely abolish the social evils of capitalist society, including economic insecurity, unemployment, and of the danger of fascism and war. However, this program of action will help the working class and the people as a whole to meet their urgent immediate practical needs, enhancing generally their strength and influence in the nation. In the struggle for the program for peace and democracy, jobs and security, favorable conditions are created for the masses of our people to recognize, on the basis of their own experiences, the need for the eventual reorganization of society along socialist lines. Commenting, so okay, there is the recognition. I would call that partial, and I still think that they're vastly overestimating the challenges that actually lay ahead. For example, just 9 years from this point, in 1954, the Communist Control Act was passed. Anyway, continuing, we shall assist this process by every available educational means, taking full cognizance of the growing interest of the American people and its working class in the historic experiences of the Soviet people in the building of a new socialist society, which has played the decisive role in the defeat of Hitler Germany and the Axis. We shall aim to convince the broad masses that the eventual elimination of the profit system and the establishment of socialism in the United States will usher in a new and higher type of democracy and a free road to unlimited and stable social progress, because it will end exploitation of man by man and nation by nation through the establishment of a society without oppression and exploitation. While not yet accepting socialism as an ultimate goal, the American people today agree that fascism must be destroyed, wherever it exists or wherever it raises its head. The American people are ready to protect and extend the Bill of Rights and all democratic liberties. They are determined to fight for greater peace and democracy, for the right to work, greater job, and social security. Therefore, communists and non-communists, all progressives and anti-fascists, can be rallied in support of the above program of immediate action. For this program meets the immediate desires of the American people, upon which the majority can unite today to prevent the rise of fascism and to assure victory in the 1945 municipal elections and in the fateful 1946 congressional elections, which must be organized and prepared for now. This is a program which must be championed in every factory and industry, in every community and state, through the medium of labor's political action, through labor's joint and parallel action locally, and through broad shop steward conferences and united community movements, as well as through other broad united peoples and Democratic Front activities. So that's the end of part one. To me, I'm going to say this. I think reading that, just from the tone of it, from what is said and what isn't said, I think that peaceful transition, which would eventually come up in about another decade in the CPSU, is more or less implied by the tone here. This sounds to me more reformist than Marxist-Leninist. That's not even getting into theoretical errors in the list of demands. It's more of an impression of the overall tone. While I understand the stated reason for this approach, that the U.S. masses have not accepted the need for socialism, it seems to me that the party is backing off of that in practice. That's my read of this. Anyway, continuing. Part 2, Section 5. The foregoing program demands a resolute struggle. The reactionaries will seek desperately to divide the ranks of the people, to pit one group against the other, veterans and farmers against labor, Gentile against Jew, white against Negro, Protestant against Catholic, AFL against CIO. They will strive to break the Anglo-Soviet American coalition and foment bitter class strife, class, racial, partisan, and sectional strife. For these purposes, they will use Hitler's secret weapon of white supremacy and anti-communism, and make maximum use of the David Dubinsky and Norman Thomas Social Democrats, the Trotskyites, as well as the John L. Lewises and Matthew Walls. To meet the situation, the people need a great strengthening of every one of their progressive organizations, and particularly the organizations of labor, the trade unions. They need loyal, courageous, and honest leadership, men and women who combine clarity of vision with the qualities of firmness in principle and flexibility in tactics. Above all, they require a larger, stronger, more influential, and more effective mass communist party. The communists have a greater responsibility to labor and the nation than at any other time in their history. Again, with the national unity stuff. And these greater responsibilities can be fulfilled by us with honor because of our long record of devotion and service to the cause of the working class and the people, and by our adherence to the scientific principles of Marxism-Leninism. The American communist movement confidently faces the future. We are proud of our consistent and heroic struggle against reaction and fascism over the years. We draw strength from and are particularly proud of our efforts to promote victory over Nazi barbarism and Japanese imperialism. On the field of battle and on the home front, we communists have been in the forefront of the fight to defend our country and our people. In the struggle for the establishment of the anti-Hitlerite coalition, for the opening of the Second Front, for defeating fascist militarist Japan, for national unity, for the re-election of Roosevelt, for the rights of the Negro people, for building a strong and progressive labor movement, for uninterrupted war production, and for the attainment of international trade union unity, the contributions of the communists have been vital and second to none. Section 6. We recognize that the future of the labor and progressive movements, and therefore the role of the United States in world affairs, will depend to no small extent upon the correctness of our communist policy, our independent role and influence, our mass activities, and organized strength. That is why today we communists must not only learn from our achievements in the struggle against fascism and reaction, but also from our weaknesses and errors. In the recent period, especially since January 1944, these mistakes consisted in drawing a number of erroneous conclusions from the historic significance of the Tehran Accord. Among these false conclusions was the concept that after the military defeat of Germany, the decisive sections of big capital would participate in the struggle to complete the destruction of fascism and would cooperate with the working people in the maintenance of post-war national unity. The reactionary class nature of finance capital makes these conclusions illusory. This has been amply demonstrated by recent events revealing the post-war aims of the trusts and cartels, which seek imperialist aggrandizement and huge profits at the expense of the people. This revision of Marxist-Leninist theory regarding the role of monopoly capital led to other erroneous conclusions, such as to utopian economic perspectives and the possibility of achieving the national liberation of the colonial and dependent countries through arrangements between the great powers. It also led to tendencies to obscure the class nature of bourgeois democracy, to false concepts of social evolution, to revision of the fundamental laws of the class struggle, and to minimizing the independent and leading role of the working class. In consequence, we communists began to carry on the historic struggle against fascism, for democracy, and national freedom in a way that was not always clearly distinguishable from that of bourgeois democrats and bourgeois nationalists, forgetting the class character and limitations of bourgeois democracy and nationalism. Finally, this right opportunist deviation also tended to ignore, revise, or virtually discount the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, declaring wrongly that the changed and changing forms of their expression indicated that they had ceased to operate in the period of the general crisis of capitalism. Furthermore, the dissolution of the Communist Party and the formation of the Communist Political Association were part and parcel of our revisionist errors, and did in fact constitute the liquidation of the independent and vanguard role of the communist movement. As a consequence, our base among the industrial workers was seriously weakened. This further resulted in a general weakening of communist activities and in adversely affecting the roles and policies of other Marxist parties in the Western Hemisphere. Far from aiding the carrying out of such correct policy as the support for Roosevelt's re-election, the dissolution of the Communist Party weakened the Democratic coalition because it weakened the initiative, strength, and contributions of the communist vanguard. A flagrant expression of this liquidation was the abolition of the communist organization in the South through its transformation into non-communist, anti-fascist organizations. This action undermined the foundation for consistent and effective struggle for the needs and aspirations of the masses of the South, especially the Negro people. This glaring example of the logical outcome of our revisionist errors reveals the direction in which our policy was leading. The dissolution of the Communist Party of America and the formation of the CPA was in fact the liquidation of the independent Marxist Party of the working class. The correction of our revisionist errors demands the immediate reconstitution of the Communist Party and guaranteeing the reestablishment of the Marxist content of its program, policies, and activities. The source of our past revisionist errors must be traced to the ever-active pressure of bourgeois ideology and influences upon the working class. The failure on our part to be vigilant and to conduct a sustained struggle against these bourgeois and petty bourgeois influences permitted their infiltration into our own ranks and sapped our proletarian vitality. One of the most harmful and far-reaching consequences of this bourgeois influence upon our organization was the development over a period of years of a system of bureaucratic practices and methods of leadership. This found expression in a failure to analyze and re-examine constantly our policies and methods of work in the spirit of Marxist self-criticism, to check our policies with the experiences of the masses in the class struggle, to develop the correct cadre policy, and to draw our full membership into the shaping and clarification of basic policy. The crassest example of this was the suppression of the Foster letter from the membership. Another example of this bureaucratic method of work was the manner in which the former National Board proceeded to liquidate the communist organization in the South. The growth of revisionism was helped by bureaucracy. While the main responsibility for the bureaucratic regime rests upon Browder in the first place, the former National Board and National Committee must assume a heavy responsibility for the bureaucratic system of work which prevailed in all party organizations. The former National Board, in accepting the Browder system of leadership, set a bureaucratic example and did not carry on a struggle to establish genuine democracy in the organization. This was also reflected by the former board's inadequate self-criticism during the pre-convention period. The incoming National Committee and Board, by example, and with the active assistance of the membership, must undertake an ideological and organizational struggle to root out all vestiges of bureaucracy, and be constantly on guard against relapses to old bureaucratic methods of work and opportunistic practices, which could only obstruct the most rapid and complete correction of our revisionist errors. Section 7. The opportunist errors of our former general policy limited the effectiveness of communist work on the Negro question. This was especially expressed in our glossing over the national character of the Negro question, and in our unwarranted illusion that the big bourgeoisie themselves would carry forward after VE Day the wartime gains of the Negro people. It is true that we continued to proclaim our uncompromising demand for full Negro democratic rights, and in many instances fought hard and effectively against Jim Crow practices, especially in the interests of the war effort. However, the struggle for the national liberation of the Negro people, as fundamentally related to the whole struggle of the working class against capitalist exploitation and oppression, was often lost sight of. Moreover, our revisionist policies narrowed the scope and weakened the vigor of such struggles, even causing us at times to soft-pedal the struggle to eliminate Negro discrimination in the armed forces. The results of this opportunist policy are all too apparent. We have not adequately prepared the labor movement and the Negro masses to combat current efforts of reaction to create sharp Negro-white conflicts within the ranks of labor, and to wipe out the wartime democratic gains of the Negro people. Despite limited gains, we have had serious weaknesses and inconsistencies in our work in the Negro communities, and have been unable to consolidate our thousands of new Negro recruits into a stable membership. We completely liquidated the communist organization in the South. We failed to develop a substantial core of Marxist-trained Negro workers for leadership in the labor movement. It is now incumbent upon us to give militant leadership to the struggle for Negro democratic rights on all fronts, especially intensifying our educational work among white trade unionists. We must rebuild the communist organization in the South. We must develop and bring forward a strong core of working-class Negro communist cadres in the great industrial centers of the nation. Above all, we must deepen the theoretical understanding of all communists, both Negro and white, on the fundamental nature and far-reaching implications of the Negro question, and conduct a vigorous struggle to root out every manifestation of open or concealed white chauvinism in our own ranks. As one step toward this end, we should create a special commission to undertake a basic study of the conditions and trends of the Negro people in relation to the broad social, economic, and political movements in America and the world today, and, in the light of Marxist-Leninist theory, to formulate a comprehensive definition of communist policy and program on the Negro question. Section 8. The opportunist errors which we were committing adversely influenced our work during the war, limited the effectiveness of our anti-fascist activities, and were disorienting the communist and the progressive labor movement for the post-war period. Our communist organization was moving toward a crisis, among other things, because of its inability to answer the growing complex problems arising out of the present world situation. This developing crisis could not be resolved without the full recognition and correction of our former revisionist policies. In this connection, therefore, we must recognize the sterling leadership and the important contributions which Comrade Foster made in the struggle against opportunism. Likewise, we can appreciate the basic correctness of the sound, fraternal, Marxist opinions expressed in the recent article of Jacques Duclos, one of the foremost leaders of the Communist Party of France. Life itself, especially our recent experiences in the struggle against the forces of fascism and reaction on both the foreign and domestic fronts, in the trade unions, in the struggle for Negro rights, in the struggle against the trusts, has fully confirmed the validity of Comrade Duclos' criticism and of Comrade Foster's repeated warnings, and has fully exposed the basic revisionist errors of American communist policy since January 1944. In ascertaining the grave responsibility for the opportunist errors and mistakes committed in the recent period, it is necessary to state that while Comrade Browder, who was the foremost leader of the CPA, bears a proportionately greater share of responsibility than any other individual leader or member, the former national leadership, and in the first place the former national board, must and does assume a heavy responsibility for these errors. Clearly, the single most essential precondition necessary to enable us to perform effectively our communist duties in the post-war period as the vanguard and champion of the interests of the working class and the nation is to overcome quickly and decisively our errors and mistakes, especially to eradicate all vestiges of opportunism in our policies and mass work. Toward this end, the entire communist organization must immediately make a thorough and self-critical examination of all policies and leadership. We must establish genuine inner democracy and self-criticism throughout our organization. We must refresh and strengthen the personnel of all responsible leading committees in the organization and establish real collective leadership in all party committees. In doing this, we must combat all tendencies toward factionalism, toward distortions, and toward weakening the basic unity of our communist organization. At the same time, we communists must avoid all sectarian tendencies and boldly and energetically expand our own Marxist working class and anti-fascist mass activities and our most active participation in the broad labor and democratic movements. We must resolutely strengthen our independent communist role and mass activities. We must develop a consistent concentration policy and build our communist organization, especially among the industrial workers. We must wage a resolute ideological struggle on the theoretical front, enhancing the Marxist understanding of our entire organization and leadership. We communists renew our pledge to do everything to destroy fascism and reaction, to advance the cause of American and world democracy, the cause of national freedom and social progress. We are determined to cooperate with all anti-fascists and all democratic forces to achieve these great objectives. And that's the end of the audiobook. So, I made reference a few times in here to Foster. Technically, this document is credited to the National Convention of the Communist Party. However, Foster was the national chairman, just to clarify that point. Anyway, I have given my thoughts already. I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are. If you'd like to leave them in the comments section, we will proceed with the discussion from there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation's encouraging, and they're also materially helpful, helping me to spend more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, and remember to connect with your local left, network with other people engaged in the class struggle, find out about projects you may not have found out about any other way, but which you might be able to contribute to, and continue your education there in the real world doing practical work, taking what you've learned here and elsewhere into your local organizations. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.